Another area where layers interact with one another is where After Effects allows layer information, pixel information between layers to interact through modes. Modes are a way of using light and dark values or color values, what we call luminance and chrominance, between the different layers and the combination of that pixel information to either darken or lighten or emphasize or de-emphasize areas of specific images as or video as you make that pixel information interact with one another. For example, look at the two images that we have in this composition. If you look at this composition, the two images basically have the same information. However, through modes, I can emphasize the lightness or darkness of one on top of the other. What does that mean? And you know this from programs such as Photoshop and Illustrator, I am sure. So in order to access the switches and modes, what you want to do, let me close this really quick because I want to get my composition the way you probably have it at this point, which is like this. This is how you would start the by default. So you see your switches, which we talked about in the previous video. Now, in order to access the modes, you have one of two ways of doing this. One of the ways to do it is by right-clicking anywhere on this bar and selecting from the columns drop-down what you want to have visible. As you can see, you have modes in here. If you're running short on real estate, as you saw a second ago when I first started closing those panels, you can go ahead and say, for example, if you activate the modes, you'll notice that the modes and switches button is going from the bottom, but now you have your modes and modes menu available here. Let me close it again by going to that columns area and closing it. You notice that when I close it, now I have this button that allows me to switch between the switches and modes menus, saving you a bit of real estate. The shortcut switch between those two is the F4 key on your keyboard. F4 is the shortcut for that switch. So if you want to use the shortcut in order to flip between one and the other, that's a faster workflow and still saves you real estate. So with that done, just like in Photoshop, when we click, let's say, for example, we select this layer here and I click on the modes, you will notice that you have a lot more options than you do in Photoshop or Illustrator because we're talking about video and motion graphics. So they offer you a lot more modes within this environment, specifically this area down here, what we call the stencil area. Now, as you know from Photoshop, probably, most likely you know it, this area, all of these subdivisions here represent different things of how the pixels interact with one another on the screen. So if I look at this area up here, that means anything within this menu, this submenu, makes use of the dark information. It keeps the dark information and pushes back the light information, meaning it will emphasize only the dark areas. Down here, the next section emphasizes the light areas. So when I activate any of these, whatever is light on the top image will be emphasized on top of the bottom one, and anything that's dark will become transparent. Overlay makes full use of both chrominance and luminance, placing emphasis on chrominance in order to combine the color and lightness information of the image and actually create that interaction with the pixels behind it. I like to call this down here the psychedelic ones because they create really weird results. All of these two menus, the hue and all of those make use of the colors to drop or make other colors light or combine colors between what's in the pixels in the image behind and those that are in the front. Stencils will be something that we'll talk about in just a second. So let's go back and say, for example, I want to make everything darker on that image. So if I click darken, you'll notice that not much happens. But if I choose multiply, suddenly all of those dark areas on this top image become dark, make the image below darker. So if I turn it on and off, you'll see the difference between those two. Now let me switch that mode from multiply to something like screen. And now it gets brighter in the areas where things are brighter. So you'll notice that whatever the image was light, it will use the light information of that file on top of it to make it lighter. If I choose from the drop-down overlay, which is one of people's favorites, that uses a combination of both light values, dark values, and chrominance, the actual colors, to emphasize colors and make the darkers darker and the lighters lighter. So you get a lot more contrast when you use that particular mode. If you look at the other ones, the psychedelic ones, some of them do nothing. Some of them create really weird things, some weird effects, such as hue, for example, might create and they usually don't work when you have the same image. So you need to have something that is completely different on top of that image. But you have the ability to use these for basically the same way that you would do in Photoshop. Now, let's go ahead and look at an actual use of something like this. So let's go to the texture file, to the texture option, the whatchamacallit, the app that I have here, and the layer that I have here, the composition, sorry, that I have here, and I have something called texture, which is a solid that I had created in this particular composition. I'm actually going to replace that footage with the footage of, where is it? No, not that one. Woods, nope. Forest. And let's see if I can bring in. Actually, I'm going to import that file really quick. Let me go to lecture 3, and I am going to find the file. I think it's called clouds. There it is. So I'm going to import this file, clouds, and then I'm going to replace that footage, this layer, with that footage. To do that, you select the footage on the project window, select that layer that you want to replace it with on the composition window, and then press the keys Control, Alt, and backslash. Now, backslash is the key that is under the question mark. So if you look at your keyboard, it's on the bottom row. It would be the one right next to the Shift key on the right-hand side of the keyboard. So if you press Control, Alt, and that backslash, you will replace whatever layer you have selected here with the footage that you have selected on the composition window. Now, let's go ahead and use the overlay settings on this, and you notice that basically it applied the color on the chrominance value, and it made the darkers of the clouds darker on the trees, and the lighters of the clouds lighter on the actual image. Now, over here, I should see the psychedelic ones come into action, because now I have the ability to make use of all that chrominance information to make things go wild. So as you can see, you can actually apply a coloration to something through these modes. Now, let's say, for example, what I really want is I want to create something that allows me to create a stencil. So that means if I want to have, say, for example, all of this content, these 3 layers, dock, water slide, and forest, all appear inside this title, Earth. Now, we haven't talked about titles yet or how to type text. It's fairly simple, but we'll talk about that in a couple of classes. But let's say, for example, I want to do it in an image that I brought in. So in this image, I'm going to replace this image that I have from the outside of the project. It's a title, and it has transparency. As you can see, it says millions of colors plus. And remember when we first talked about transparencies, if I see that over here, it's telling me that I have information that is transparency information. So if I want to replace this title with that footage, I'll select both, Control, Alt, backslash, and now it tells me, oh, the layer doesn't have a source. So, of course, this is a title, so it won't replace it. This title was created within the actual After Effects environment. So I'm going to simply delete it. I'm going to select it, and I'm going to hit the delete key on the keyboard, and it goes away. Now, let me put that file on top of everything. Now you see that this file has transparency around it. I see the text inside it, and it has transparency. That indicates to me that there is some sort of alpha information. Alpha information is what allows you to see through, basically making things transparent, or it gives you the opacity at full visual, which means I can see. So these areas are transparent, these areas are at full opacity, meaning I have some sort of alpha channel around this thing. Now, the alpha channel might not be created. This was something that I brought in from Illustrator, but I turned it into a PNG. PNG 24 is a file format that allows you to save alpha information. So if you want to export alpha information from, say, Photoshop, you can go ahead and save the file as a PNG file. But fortunately for you, After Effects recognizes Photoshop files in their native format. So you can simply save the file even with layers, even with layer transparency, layer masks, and it will respect that transparency in this environment. But in this case, I have flattened all this, and this is for the San Francisco MoMA. That's the logo for that place. So now what I want to do is I want to use that information, that alpha information, to break almost like a cookie cutter hole on all the layers that are behind it. So that mode is called Stencil Alpha. So when I do that, you'll notice that wherever my title was visible, I see whatever happens to be stacked underneath it. Whatever it was transparent, it stencils all that out and it goes away. This is one way to create a stencil. The only backdrop of this is that it doesn't matter what I do. If I keep on adding things behind it, it will still keep on cutting. As you can see, I place the clouds image behind it, but I don't see it. If I bring it up on the stack, it's going to cover all the other things because that's the image that's at the top. So the stencil works across. It basically cuts across the entirety of the layer stack that you have on your composition. So be careful when using that. There's a way to creating this same effect and maintaining the background. And we're going to talk about that in the next video that we do through pre-compositions. Okay, so that is what when we're talking about modes, this is what we're referring to in After Effects. When we talk about modes, this is how you access them and how you apply them. Now, let's talk a bit about mattes in detail. So you have Stencil Luma makes use of the lighting information. So if you have Stencil Luma, it's going to look at the color of whatever happens to be visible. In this case, it was red, if I'm not mistaken. Let me go back. See, that's red. So that is not a full strength color. It's not full white. So when you go at Stencil Luma, you see that it looks like it's semi-transparent. It basically dims down because that red was not really that bright. So because of that, it's going to make everything a bit toned down. That is when you have Luma information. You can do both stencils through Luma and Alpha. Alpha, transparency, Luma, light. When you do Silhouette, you're doing the reverse effect. You're basically cutting a hole through the Alpha information on the top layer through all the layers below it. And Stencil Luma, same thing. You have a semi-cut hole. So you basically have these semi-transparent areas wherever that information happens to be. So we're going to talk, you can basically make use of these, but again, once again, they cut through the entirety of the composition, as you can see. And as you saw, I was able to put the clouds below the stack, and it didn't show in the composition. So because of that, honestly, I seldom find myself using stencils here. I use something else called track matting, and we're going to be talking about that in a video next week. So that is how you access modes in After Effects.